Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Reardon. Welcome to this month's edition of Dig Your Dinner. Today we are talking about sweet potatoes. Very versatile crop, a very easy to grow crop, but there's several factors that you'll want to keep in mind as you're growing them, just to be sure that you're successful, right? So I'm here, Chelsea's here. We're going to delve into not only how to grow them, but also the nutrition and the recipes that you can incorporate them to, and just in time for the holidays, which is everyone loves their sweet potatoes at Thanksgiving, so great time to be discussing it. So I always give a plug for this, and this month's never not different as well. The Kansas Garden Guide, great resource for any kind of vegetable gardening that you are trying to do. It doesn't just cover the crops you're trying to grow, but it also covers diseases. It also covers the methods to growing them, season extension, growing in the fall. I mean, anything you want to learn about, it's in there. So great resource to check out. Also, pertaining to sweet potatoes specifically, if you search online, sweetpotatoes.edu, you're going to find all the publications that come from extension resources from across the country, and all of them have great information on being able to grow sweet potatoes because it's a very popular crop across the United States. So a bit of an overview of our sweet potatoes today. They are part of the Convolvulaceae family. They are a root crop. They're not a tuber. They're actually the roots of the plant. And these are more so actually related to morning glories than any kind of other plant that you may see in the garden. So kind of rare. Obviously, you're not planting morning glories usually intentionally. They're a bit of a weed for a lot of people. But in this instance, you're definitely utilizing them for a crop as well. And obviously they're utilized ornamentally also as a vine. But in this instance, we're talking about growing the roots and not growing those vines. So one of the things to be keeping in mind with your sweet potatoes is that they are a warm season crop. These are very cold sensitive, so that's something that you're going to hear me repeatedly stating throughout this portion of the presentation. It's just that you've got to be watching the temperatures with your sweet potatoes, otherwise they're going to suffer. There are different varieties and types available, which we'll delve into, and then there's also special harvest and curing considerations. Curing is very important with your sweet potatoes because they basically don't have a skin when they come out of the ground, which we'll delve into as well. So the three main types of varieties that we are going to delve into with your sweet potatoes, because these are the ones that are available on the markets. These are the ones that people are planting and trying to utilize. And these include white flesh, orange flesh, and purple flesh. The white flesh sweet potatoes, these are generally known as being drier and less sweet, so they're not as popular. The orange flesh, however, are the most popular and the most commonly grown throughout the US because they're both sweet and they're moist. So that is why you're going to find dozens and dozens of varieties of your orange flesh sweet potatoes. Those are going to be the most commonly available varieties. As far as your purple flesh go, these are very popular in Asia. They're starting to become more popular in the US, but they're less commonly available in the US. And they're also a little bit tricky to grow in the US, specifically because they have a very long growing period. One of the things that you'll need to pay attention to with your potato varieties is specifically their growing length and how long it takes to get them to crop size, which we'll delve into a little bit more here with your purple sweet potato specifically, because I want to use this as an example. Generally, when you are planting just any kind of sweet potato here in Kansas, the recommended time is mid-June. The thing with purple sweet potatoes is they take 5 months to develop to a crop. So if you plant in mid-June, it's going to be November and it's going to be too cold, it's going to freeze, and your crop's not going to be able to finish by the time they're supposed to be ready, right? So you actually have to plant these much earlier than you would your normal sweet potatoes. You have to aim for late May to early June. And even in that window, it's going to be tricky because you plant in late May, that puts you in October. So if you've got an early freeze in October, that's going to take out your crop. And again, you have an unfinished crop. So that's another reason that purple sweet potatoes are a little bit difficult here in the US. They're not impossible. And that is because there are other considerations you can take into effect. You can try to find some varieties that are a bit faster maturing. That may help you out as well. And then even the use of season extension. So that is like using low tunnels and creating kind of a greenhouse effect on top of those purple sweet potatoes. That can get you through at least those first mild freezes and help your crop extend to its full growing time that it needs to produce. So as far as a few varieties worth trying in the Kansas City area, I have here listed as the early maturing varieties, the Beauregard, the Georgia Jet, and Covington. Personally, I've got had great results with both the Beauregard and Covington. They're both an orange flesh sweet potato. They produce a lot uh, of crop for you. Also, if you want to try the JC Japanese, Hernandez, or Jewel, these are late maturing varieties. So again, the weather has to be cooperating with you a bit because it can't be cold outside. They won't perform well. They'll die and the crop will be ruined. But these are ones that are commonly grown in Missouri, probably more southern Missouri. So if you can again practice season extension or put it in a protected area a bit, you may be able to get by with those varieties. So as far as planting sweet potatoes goes, we generally use something called sweet potato slips, which is the beginning vine stages of the shoots that are coming out of the roots. These are planted into mounds, which we'll talk about how to form those. And these, as well as the roots, are again cold sensitive. So it's not just the roots that are cold sensitive, it's the entire plant. So they can be injured by any kind of cold weather. So if you're planting them even early in the season, you need to be sure that it's going to at least be 55 degrees or above outside. Below that, that's when your plants are going to begin to suffer. So it says here, wait until mid to late May to begin planting for sure. Generally, here in Kansas, again, we try to plant around mid-June, and you'll have a successful crop using those typical varieties. The soil is also a big factor with your sweet potatoes. So if you have a heavy soil, if there's a lot of clay in it, this is something that you're going to want to take into account. Also, if you've had root knot nematodes in your soil, that's something that very much affects sweet potatoes. So with both of those considerations, you need to be looking at the specific variety of sweet potato you're growing and making sure that it can accommodate for either heavy soils or the root knot nematode. Variety selection is the best way to overcome those challenges. So as far as sweet potato slips go, you can source them from local garden centers, or there's, several places throughout the state you can order them from. But there's also methods to growing your own sweet potatoes. So if you were to say just wanting to go to the grocery store, take a root and produce some shoots from it, you can do that. That said, there's a chance that those roots may be diseased, so that's something you need to be keeping in mind. Because if you introduce that disease to your soil, then that disease can persist in your soil. Then you have to practice crop rotation or solarization or something to sterilize that issue. But if you were to go this route, all you would have to do is, well, there's a couple different methods. You could try the container with sand method, which is kind of demonstrated here on the left. They don't have sand that they're utilizing there. It looks like they're just using water, but sand will encourage the moisture retention and then also encourage the adventitious roots forming from that roots. And then obviously you're getting your shoots. Your shoots then become your slips. The other method that you see here is just using the old standard of putting half of the roots in water, right? And then you develop those adventitious roots, and you're obviously getting a lot of shoots and vines forming from the top of that. Each of those vines are your slips that will be planted, and each of those will develop into their own singular sweet potato plant that develops their own set of roots from those slips. Um, Doing this, you want to definitely pay attention to timing. It's going to take about 6 weeks to get your sprouts. So, if you're aiming for mid-June planting, that means you need to do this right at the beginning of May. So it's very important to have your shoots at the correct time because you don't want them to be ready and then you're having to plant them when it's freezing outside or, vice versa. So cut the plants or cut the slips and then transplant them into the garden. We'll talk about the transplanting process. Generally, you're going to want to try to transplant them right away. I have seen people store them in a cooler, like moistened newspaper if they have to. But again, transplanting right away probably your best bet as far as success. Probably don't refrigerate them. Again, they're cold sensitive, so it needs to be at that 55 degrees or above. That said, if you can keep it in the 55 to like 60 range, that's going to be your best preservation of the plants until they can get into the ground. So making mounds. Mounds are necessary for your root development because these are the bearing area of your crop. So if you want a big crop, that crop needs to have a place to be growing into. They also supply adequate drainage for the plants. So sweet potatoes, they love a moist soil, but they also like to rot. So the drainage is what is going to enable that rot from not taking place. Again, they love heat, so it's going to need to be in a full sun location, meaning that it needs to have at least 6+ hours of direct sunlight a day. The mounds themselves should be a foot to a foot and a half tall, and then spacing them about 3 feet apart from each other. That's just going to give those vines room to grow, the roots room to expand, and it's going to give you room to get in there and do maintenance. You can do this utilizing the current garden soil you have. You can bring in more topsoil. It may be a little bit tricky to get those mounds that tall with the soil that's in place there. So you may have to bring in some excess or additional support for those mounds. This can also include compost, which is going to obviously add all those beneficial organisms and increase the moisture retention of your soil, but also give that adequate amount of drainage. You do want to try to avoid excessively rich soil. This is very important. So you'll get a lot of people sometimes saying, "Oh, I tried to grow sweet potatoes this year and it just grew a bunch of vines and it never had a crop." That is almost entirely because people have used an overly fertile soil. When it does that, it grows a lot of foliage and it doesn't grow any roots. So if it has too much nitrogen or even some of your phosphorus or potassium, if those are in way excess, you are not going to get a great crop. You will get a lot of vines. Um, and then you also want to check your mounds throughout the growing season. So this is important because your mounds are going to settle, right? And your roots are only going to get bigger and bigger. Now, it's not necessarily going to suffer in quality of the crop. If they do become exposed to air, they're not like potatoes where if they, become green, you're poisoning people. These can be exposed to air and they'll likely be underneath a thick mat of vines. But the more those are exposed above the ground, that is exposing them to wildlife feeding on them, exposing them to disease, exposing them to pests that may be feeding on them. So it's best to be topping off these mounds with your additional soil throughout the season. So when it comes to planting the sweet potato slips themselves, you want to be spacing them about a foot apart, and you can actually bury a pretty significant portion of the vine. Generally, when you have your slips, they don't look like this. They don't have those adventitious roots on the bottom. It's literally just a cut piece of vine. So if you bury that length of vine, leaving the leaves themselves above the ground so that they can continue to photosynthesize. That is going to be your best bet as far as getting those slips established. You are going to want to, because of the lack of adventitious roots, anticipate initial wilting. And with that initial wilting, you need to remember no roots to absorb stuff means you've got to have ample moisture there. So you can absolutely not let your ground dry out as these are establishing. Once your sweet potatoes are established, and we'll get into this in water in a little bit, they will begin to be a little bit more drought resistant, but definitely as they're establishing moisture is of great importance. You also wanted to anticipate initial weed pressure because you're going to have a lot of just bare soil here as this is beginning to establish. So your methods for taking care of these, we recommend just getting a garden hoe out there or hand pulling these weeds. Eventually, once your plants start taking off, you're going to get a thick, thick mat of vines on top of these plants. So, in fact, these vines, they reach 6 to 8 feet long. So eventually this will suppress the weeds themselves. But until then, getting in there and hand pulling and just pulling them out manually is the best method. And I did want to mention here as well that if you are having too big of vines or they're going all over the place, you can just pull them back on top of each other. So it's literally just pulling it back, rolling them on top of them. It's not going to harm the plants, and that can help you consolidate space a bit. So as far as watering sweet potatoes goes, as I mentioned, they love a well-draining soil. And when they are establishing, they need a consistently moist soil. But once they are established, they will have a bit of more tolerance when it comes to drier periods. That said, they are going to produce more for you if you can provide supplemental water during those drier periods. So during the summer, when the heat comes and when the ground's starting to dry out, if you can add a little bit excuse me, you can add a little bit of supplemental moisture. That is going to help out your plants. A drip system with consistent watering is going to be ideal because this is placing your water directly onto the ground and it's keeping that moisture off the leaves. So that's preventing diseases, that's preventing weed growth. You're getting the water directly to the root crop where it needs to be. And so then when it comes to harvest, you're actually going to want to wait with your sweet potatoes until the very end of the season. Literally right before the first frost is when it is recommended to pull your sweet potatoes out of the ground. And that is because sweet potato quality does not degrade by the size that it gets. So these can get as large as they possibly can. You see a photo here from a sunset garden down on the bottom left. That was from this year. I mean, that's the size of a human torso, and that it may take the length of time it takes a turkey to cook to get that to process, but the quality of the sweet potato itself is not going to degrade. Um, so the roots can get as large as possible. When you are actually pulling them out of the ground, there's a few things to keep in mind. So you take your vines. This is your first step. You completely remove your vines and roll them back and get them away from your growing space. Then digging from the outside in, you want to try to use something like a spade fork, and you just kind of pry the ground up, moving slowly inward so that you're not damaging that crop. You want to remove your potatoes very carefully because, as I mentioned, they basically don't have a skin at this point. It's less than paper thin. So the most minimal of scratches is going to damage your crop. It's actually recommended because of this best practice to pry your potatoes up and then just kind of leave them in place for a couple hours so they can at least get a minimal skin there before you then go on to the curing process. And then you also want to double check your work because sweet potatoes like to hide. So definitely, use that pitchfork to pry the ground and all of the surrounding area and make sure you're getting all of them out of there. So the curing process itself, I mentioned that leaving it on the ground right after digging them up is best practice. It's not necessarily, in my experience, fully necessary, but again, if you're trying to have completely unblemished crops, go ahead and do that. But then when it comes to storing them, you want to put them into well-ventilated containers, and these need to cure in a warm and humid location for at least 7 to 10 days. The ideal temperature to do this is 85 to 90 degrees, which is probably difficult for most people to achieve, just in a natural location. That said, all I have to say is do your best. I've had great success just putting it into a shed that's facing the sun. So if you have a shed that or a location in general that stays warm throughout the day, and it stays ventilated, that's going to be your ideal location to let these cure for a couple of weeks to develop an actual skin that can then preserve them. And then when it comes to long-term storage, sweet potatoes are something that can be stored for quite a long time. If you're doing it correctly, it can be from 6 to 10 months. So if you just harvested them now and you're storing them correctly, you can basically have them all the way up to when you're planting sweet potatoes again. That said, again, it's a cold sensitive crop. So these crops, even after harvest, are still alive, meaning they are very much sensitive to the cold. And you don't want that temperature they're being stored in to be anywhere below 50 degrees. The lowest temperature that is recommended is 55 degrees. And if you're able to do that in a well-ventilated location, that is going to be the ideal location for long-term storage. You also want to, at least monthly be checking these crops. If there's anything that's rotting, you want to get it out of there so it doesn't contaminate anything else. Just check for quality, periodically. And then if you are experiencing cold damage, which you may, question sometimes if something dips a little bit too cold, poor quality in general. So you'll start to see the roots starting to shrivel up, poor flavors, and then dark coloring are all indications that something's gone awry. So when it comes to common concerns that you will encounter with your sweet potatoes, cracking and distortion, this one is very common with any kind of drought. So again, that moist but well-draining soil is going to be very key for a healthy crop. Low yield, again, that means you've got way too fertile of a soil. So you need to watch and make sure you've got a moderately fertile soil, but not too much fertilizer in there. There's also a fungal disease called scurf, which you see in the middle left here. This is generally introduced by the type of slip that's being introduced to the ground. So you'll want to watch what your slip source was, use a different slip source the coming year, try crop rotation if you've experienced it, and then you might even try solarization of the soil just to kind of sterilize that ground and then not reintroduce that pathogen to the next round of crops. White grubs can also be an issue with this. The thing with white grubs and vegetable gardens in general is that there are no chemical controls for them in a vegetable garden setting. Obviously, in a lawn setting, there's a lot of options out there, but those are not labeled for a vegetable garden. So the best things you can do with white grubs, hand pick them out. Crop rotation is going to help you out as well because there may be certain crops that they prefer over others. And then solarization again is another option. And if you're not familiar with solarization, this is when you take like a mat tarp, you cover the entire garden bed, and then you basically allow the soil to bake in the sun, and it effectively sterilizes everything underneath. But the thing with that is it kills the bad micro organisms, and it also kills the good microorganisms. So basically, after you do that, you have to then go back into your garden and rebuild that soil profile so that you have a healthy soil there to sustain your plants. Wire worms can also be an issue here, seen on the bottom left. In that case, if you're seeing these, pyrethrins and diatomaceous earth can be a solution. And then I've had a lot of experience with voles actually feeding on sweet potatoes as well. So this is what it'll look like on the bottom right. There's a lot of trap options out there, and there's other options as well. If you're experiencing vole issues, just reach out to the extension office, and we can inform you of what your options are. And then finally, to wrap up my portion of this, I wanted to throw something fun in here. So, did you know sweet potatoes are not yams? The two are completely unrelated plants. The common name yam has been given to the sweet potato, specifically in the southern United States, but it is not a true yam. True yams are the thick, fleshy roots of another different type of vine crop. However, they grow as long cylindrical tubers, and they are harvested in sections, as you see here in this photo. So, completely different crop. They just happen to get the same name within the South. And with that, I will open it up to questions real quick, and then we can hand it over to Chelsea.
All right. So I am Chelsea Reinberg, and I'm going to talk about the nutrition. So I am the nutrition, food safety, and health agent here in the extension office and cover all things related to what you do in the kitchen after you've harvested your food. So why eat sweet potatoes? This is kind of the first thing we start with always is the nutrition and the benefit. So sweet potatoes are a really nutrition powerhouse. I'm going to go through briefly some of the nutrition information for 1 cup of baked sweet potato, and this includes the skin. We don't talk about fiber too much in this presentation, but we've talked about it in previous presentations that really, when possible, we do want to incorporate the skin of our fruits and vegetables because they do have some of that great insoluble fiber that helps to keep our gut healthy and is just great for nutrition. So with skin, it is a higher calorie food, unlike what we had for broccoli and cauliflower last month. Those are lower calorie foods, and what we call those is kind of the non-starchy vegetables. So our sweet potatoes and potatoes are more along the lines of those starchy vegetables. So they are higher in calories as well as higher in grams of carbohydrate. So if you are looking for foods, whether you're diabetic or pre-diabetes and you're trying to limit carbohydrates, you do just want to watch portion sizes with your starchy vegetables like sweet potatoes. They have 4 grams of protein. The fiber is quite high at 6.6 grams per 1 cup of baked with, again, the skin. That fiber will be decreased if you remove that skin and only have the inside flesh. The few nutrients that are really the standout nutrients I want to highlight is our vitamin A, and I'm going to talk more about that, but we have over 200% of our daily needs. And then we have vitamin C, which is about 45%. Also, other nutrients of importance are manganese, copper, and some of our B vitamins, and potassium and niacin. Regular white potatoes are also a great source of potassium, as are sweet potatoes. Again, Anthony did talk about the different types of flesh. And so we have our white, our orange, and our purple. The different colors does signify different nutrients. Understanding that the basic core components of your main carbohydrates, proteins, fiber is all going to be relatively the same for all the varieties, whether it is white, orange, or purple. However, nutritionally, there will be some differences among those. So our brighter ones, our orange and our purple, is going to be a little bit richer in some of our antioxidants. And when we think about antioxidants, they are really what keeps us nice and healthy. They keep our cells healthy. They help prevent against some chronic diseases like cancer, and they are typically found in our richer vitamins, or excuse me, our richer fruits and vegetables. So we have anthocyanins, which is our purple foods. And so our purple sweet potatoes would fall in that category, along with purple cabbage, our purple grapes. Those are going to have anthocyanins. Anthocyanins are really great for heart health and have other functions, but heart health is kind of their primary one. And then we have carotenoids, which is our oranges. And our carotenoids are really good. They are a kind of similar principle of keep our cells healthy, but they're also great for immune function and keeping our eyesight nice and healthy. So you probably heard maybe as a kid growing up, eat your carrots so that you can see and your eyes are nice and rich. Same with our sweet potatoes, our orange flesh ones. They are rich in beta carotene. And so I lived in Zambia for a couple of years. And one of the things, they had a lot of the white fleshed sweet potatoes over there. But through kind of some different organizations, they started to introduce these orange flesh sweet potatoes. And that's because in a lot of developing countries, they still have vitamin A deficiencies. So they have night blindness and other conditions related to the eyes. And so they've started to introduce these orange flesh sweet potatoes to really help ensure that kids and adults, both in developing countries, are having a rich supply of these beta carotene foods and having good eyesight. The other reason why we want to eat sweet potatoes is they're naturally sweet. And so you don't need to have a lot of additions to them. And we're going to talk about different ways to prepare them. But our sweet potatoes, hence the name, are sweeter than our traditional white potatoes. So another thing that we do not do here in the US, but they do in Zambia and several other countries, is eat the leaves. So typically in the US, whether you grow sweet potato leaves or whether you buy your sweet potatoes from the store, you will not find sweet potato leaves readily available for purchase. When I was kind of looking at any places that might, I did see that some of the southern states, you might be able to find them in like local farmers markets and things. But you can eat the sweet potato leaves. They are edible and commonly eaten in many other countries. My first introduction to sweet potato leaves was in Africa when I was in Zambia, and they were actually really tasty. So the sweet potato leaves have a milder taste compared to many of the leafy greens. So if you aren't a fan of kale or collard greens, the leafy greens for the sweet potato leaves are more similar to spinach in terms of the taste profile. So they are a very mild taste. These leaves are also loaded with nutrients. So they actually contain more B6 and vitamin C and riboflavin than the potato itself. They still do contain a lot of vitamin A, and they contain potassium and vitamin K as well. Because they're not orange, purple, or white like the sweet potato itself, they do contain other antioxidants and other nutrients. So for example, they have chlorophyll and some other ones that give them that green color and help to keep your body nice and healthy. So if you can find sweet potato leaves, I do encourage you to try eating them, or if you grow your own sweet potatoes. The one word of caution is you want to make sure you're not picking your leaves too early, because that could obviously inhibit the growth of your sweet potatoes. But you just kind of slice them up and saute them in some oil, and they're a great addition. So the other common question I get is, are potatoes really bad for us? We often experience that we have this notion that potatoes are bad, but really it's not necessarily the potato themselves, the sweet potato or the regular potato, that's bad, but it's because of the additions we add to it. So for example, here on the right, you have the traditional kind of sweet potato casserole dish where we have our pecans and our mushroom, or not mushrooms, our marshmallows. And all of this makes our Potatoes, not quite as healthy. White potatoes, we typically load them up with butter, bacon, sour cream, all the good stuff. And so they are actually quite good for us if we are being cautious of what we are adding onto them. White potatoes and sweet potatoes both contain soluble, insoluble, and a form of resistant starches. So resistant starches have been researched at their benefit in terms of helping manage blood sugars a little bit better. And our white flesh sweet potatoes have a significantly higher resistant starch than our orange flesh sweet potatoes in both cooked and uncooked forms. So again, if you are kind of pre-diabetic or diabetic and you are trying to manage your blood sugars a little bit better, our resistant starches are helpful for that. But resistant starch is great for everybody too. And so leaning more toward those white flesh sweet potatoes might be more beneficial. The other question that we often get is, are sweet potatoes healthier than your regular white potatoes? And the short answer is they may be healthier than regular potatoes, but at the same time, they're both powerhouses in terms of their nutrition. So they have lower kind of glycemic index, which is how quickly your blood sugar is going to rise after you consume them. They do have some more fiber. And of course, they have the larger amounts of beta carotene, which is that vitamin A and eyesight. So my next slide, I guess one more slide, I'll show you kind of the actual comparison. The other thing to address with sweet potatoes is they, as Anthony said, are kind of within that morning glory family, while our regular potatoes are more of the nightshade family. The reason that some people tend to lean more toward the sweet potatoes is some of your nightshade vegetables may cause inflammation, and if you have certain chronic diseases, might not sit well with you. You probably have heard maybe people talk about nightshades and they're avoiding certain vegetables because of how it makes them feel or any chronic conditions they may have. So here's just an example of some of those nightshades. Again, some people are more sensitive to some of these nightshades compared to others. So that is also why people might tend to lean more toward the sweet potatoes compared to the regular potatoes. And here's just a kind of side-by-side comparison of your sweet potatoes versus your regular potatoes. So as you can see, relatively water, calories, protein, fat, carbs, all those are about the same. As I mentioned, your sweet potatoes, which is the far right column, is your higher. So your fiber is higher in your sweet potatoes. And then nutrition wise, you have some of your vitamins are a little bit higher. So let me kind of move my screen here. You can see the vitamin A obviously is significantly higher in our sweet potatoes compared to our regular potatoes. Same with vitamin C, but our white potatoes have more potassium than our sweet potatoes. So there's just a little bit of comparison. Some nutritionally, in terms of your vitamins and minerals, might vary, but in terms of some of the other kind of core nutrients like your calories, proteins, and fats, those are all going to be the same, whether you choose a potato or sweet potato. As Anthony mentioned, don't be fooled by the yams. Yams and sweet potatoes are different, and they actually do have different nutritional characteristics as well. So Anthony had kind of showed and talked a little bit about them. And so yams do have more calories. They are less sweet and they have less moisture. So they are not used the same in terms of the culinary world either. With yams, you do have some that less moisture. So they're typically not used the same way as a potato. You will find these in other countries and how they're cooked, but it's a little bit different, and the taste and definitely the texture is different. So preparing your sweet potatoes, there's a variety of ways to prepare sweet potatoes. You have obviously boiling, mashed, baked. You can go in sweet dishes, you can go savory dishes, fried, whether it's air fried or deep fried. There's a ton of different ways. What I do love about sweet potatoes is that they do have that multi-purpose. So it can be either sweet or savory. So obviously we have on the right, we have our sweet potato pie. You have your sweet potato casserole. I love just a roasted baked potato, or excuse me, a roasted sweet potato with cinnamon. A baked potato doesn't go well with cinnamon. So you can have kind of that different sweet or savory with the sweet potatoes compared to your more traditional white potatoes. One thing to note with our sweet potatoes is we've talked about that they're high in vitamin A. Cooking these sweet potatoes with a little bit of fat will help absorb some of that vitamin A. Vitamin A is a fat soluble vitamin. Therefore, having that additional fat will help your body absorb it a little bit better. The other thing to note is that vitamin A, as well as vitamin C, are heat sensitive. And so that means that cooking your sweet potatoes will reduce some of that beta carotene or some of that vitamin A. However, your sweet potatoes have a lot of vitamin A and beta carotene, so you're still going to have a good amount of that beneficial nutrient even after you do cook it. An interesting study had shown that boiling sweet potatoes retains more beta carotene and makes the nutrients more available than other cooking methods such as baking or frying. So if you are looking to kind of increase the nutrient and your body's ability to absorb it, then boiling them is going to be the route to go. And now we're going to talk about kind of ways to preserve it. So if you've gone to the hard work of growing it and you have a surplus of sweet potatoes, Anthony did talk about the curing process. So we want to make sure that we are pressure canning our sweet potatoes like we would our regular potatoes. They do not have a lot of acid, therefore, for safety, they must be pressure canned. It is best to can these sweet potatoes within 1 to 2 months of harvest. That's the ideal time to allow them to be able to cure, as well as keeping them kind of in a good quality. How to do the canning of the sweet potatoes. You're going to wash your potatoes and boil or steam them until they're partially soft. We don't want them to be overly soft because obviously if they do get cooked under pressure and with heat during that canning process. You will remove the skins. Typically, when we are preserving our fruits and vegetables, we do like to remove the skins. Sometimes the skin, the texture doesn't really can and changes during that canning process. And then potatoes are grown in the ground. So despite your best ways of trying to clear and get all that dirt off, you might still have a few little particles of dirt and germs that remain that we don't want to be canned into that food. You'll cut them up and then you can add salt, or if you desire not to add salt, you can leave that off. You will want to do then 1 inch of headspace, and you want to cover your hot potatoes with fresh boiling water. Or, as I said, this can be a sweet or savory dish. You can also do some type of syrup if you're going to make them into a sweet dish. Then we have dehydrating. You can dehydrate your sweet potatoes. You'll want to wash and peel, cut them into small strips or slices. You do need to blanch them. That blanching process just kind of helps to get the vegetables set and to make them a little bit soft. And then you're going to dry them. So you want to dehydrate them at about 140 degrees for 8 to 12 hours. Dehydrated foods, especially our vegetables, are great to have available on hand to throw into soups or stews or to other dishes. And that rehydration really works well with some things like our potatoes. And then freezing, you can freeze potatoes. You're going to want to choose medium to large sweet potatoes that have been cured for at least 1 week. So here, as you can see, the canning process is a little bit different. We want to wait about 1 to 2 months preserving our sweet potatoes by freezing. At least 1 week is the recommendation. You do want to blanch them or to cook them until they're almost tender in water. And then you're going to want to let them cool. You'll peel them. You can cut your sweet potatoes in half. You can slice them or mash them, however you want to store them, depending on what you're going to use them for down the line. Some sweet potatoes might become a little bit darkened in that freezing process. You maybe have noticed sweet potatoes that are canned or also frozen from past might become a little dark. And so you can either blanch your sweet potatoes in like a lemon juice solution, or you can add a little bit of that solution with your mashed potatoes. And then you're going to want to store them and freeze. So now here's just a few recipes that might be of interest to you as you're going to go into the holiday season or just having sweet potatoes in general. So one of the breads that we recently made for maybe I guess it was this past summer or spring is a sweet potato bread. We traditionally think of our banana breads and our pumpkin breads, but this sweet potato bread is a great addition to add to your repertoire of your quick breads and uses some of that cooked mashed sweet potatoes. This would be a great option of using some of that frozen mashed sweet potatoes. It's already cooked, already mashed. You can have it on hand all the time, and then you just add it to your sweet potato bread. So you can see the ingredients there. When we did this recipe, we did also make it gluten-free, and you can just substitute out that all-purpose flour for a 1-to-1 baking substitution for gluten-free flour. This is another kind of favorite recipe that we have. It's a turkey sweet potato chili. Traditionally, when you think about chili, you don't think of having any type of potato in it. And when I first did this recipe with one of our groups, some people were a little bit hesitant because they know that sweet potatoes are naturally sweet. But it actually adds a nice kind of complement to our traditional spice, our chili, our onions, our peppers, things like that. And so adding this potato, the sweet potato, just kind of adds a nice different texture as well as a nice balance of flavor. And so this recipe just calls for 1 medium sweet potato. And then this is a recipe that our ice cream class did, a sweet potato cream cheese ice cream. So if you're into making your own ice cream, you might make your kind of traditional recipes of white or chocolate ice cream. But here is a fun intake on using some other vegetables. And so it calls for a medium sweet potato, some milk, cream cheese, and then it goes through the process of making a homemade ice cream. So if you're interested and like to experiment, I encourage you to give this one a try, and it might actually become one of your favorites. And then the last one, we have a sweet potato bacon chowder. Again, our traditional chowders have a white potato, but if you're looking to change it up, you can definitely use sweet potatoes. And so this recipe specifically has bacon. If you're watching calories or if you're watching saturated fat, you could do a turkey bacon, or you could just leave the bacon off. Has some sweet potatoes, and then this also adds some other vegetables of our kale or our spinach. So we kind of get some extra vegetables. I did 2 soups as we kind of go into our winter months. Our soups and are a staple in a lot of people's rotation of recipes in our next cold month. So we have our sweet potato bacon chowder as well as our turkey sweet potato chili. So those are a few recipes that hopefully you will enjoy and get to try in the next few months. And as always, you can sign up for our In Good Health newsletter, and you can contact us with any questions you have. There's my contact information as well as our general kind of just food help email address. And if there's any questions.
Hey, Chelsea, it's Shelley Cox.
Yeah, hi, Shelley.
Hi. So where can we find these recipes? Those look really good.
Yeah, so we will share around the recording after, and then once you have the recording, you can just kind of, save the recipes through just taking either a photo, or you can always contact us and we can email you directly our recipe one.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And then there was a question, I did kind of briefly talk about boiling. So boiling, it depends on the nutrients that are lost. And some of them do get lost in the water, definitely. But in this case, the heat actually makes the nutrients sometimes more available. So it really is variable, and it kind of depends on what those nutrients are. For example, broccoli. We know that the broccoli, some of those nutrients are lost because the color of your water also changes to be a little bit green. For this instance with the sweet potatoes, boiling them hasn't seen to have the same effect, and it actually makes it more available for us to use compared to cooking. When we think about like roasting or frying our potatoes, it's typically at a higher temperature point and for longer periods of time. So that also may be the difference. I always like to use the example of tomatoes. Fresh tomatoes have lycopene, but canned tomatoes actually have more lycopene because of that heating process and kind of how it changes those nutrients and makes them more bioavailable or more available for our body to use. So nutrition and our nutrients, it's a science, and nothing is ever black and white. So sometimes you lose some nutrients, sometimes they become more available. It really just depends on the nutrients and what we're looking at. Any other questions?
Looks like Gene has a question here about the availability of yams. I've seen them canned. I don't know if they're fresh available. Probably not.
And even the canned ones are not actual yams. They're uh like you might I think I just recently saw it at one of the grocery stores. They're advertising that they have yams, and it's really not yams. It's just a variation of a sweet potato. But even the canned yams that you'll find on your store shelves are just a canned sweet potato variation. There are no kind of canned yams. The only yam you might be able to find is if you go to like an international grocery store. And I have not been to like an African market or any of the other international stores and looked specifically for a yam, but that would be the only place that you might find it. You won't see them at the traditional stores. Sometimes Hy-Vee might get some interesting and kind of different fruits or vegetables from different parts of the world in, and you might find it there, but it's not the same. Are the yams at the grocery usually white? So traditionally yams are white. Again, the key would be looking at that texture of the outer skin. If it's really hard and almost bark-like, then it very well may be a yam that has been brought in from either an African country or like a South African country. If it is a soft skin, like similar to what a sweet potato has, then that is just a sweet potato variation that they're calling a yam.
Well, we did want to give you guys a plug before we ended this. We have a ton of topics ready to go for 2025. So if you go to our website right now and look at our Dig Your Dinner page, I believe all of the registrations for the coming season are up and ready to be registered if you're interested. Coming in January, we will be discussing seed planting and starting indoor seeds. And then we'll also be discussing some healthy food highlights that Chelsea has. So lots of great topics coming up. We're going to have a lot of more fruit topics in 2025 as well. So if you're interested in growing, grapes, blueberries, strawberries, definitely stay tuned.